everybody for joining us today for our second of two roundtables at our Electoral Integrity Project virtual workshop. Today is really interesting because we have two and a third on video, former chief electoral officers who are here to share their insights and their experiences running elections. We wanted to focus on this theme of electoral management resiliency. What does it mean to be a resilient electoral management body? We've talked a lot in the previous sessions about the issues of democratic backsliding and the pressures that electoral managers are facing. There's been papers on violence against electoral officials, about the sort of executive aggrandizement. So all of these sorts of issues are really forefront in our mind. And as somebody who's been studying electoral management from the time I was doing my PhD, this question of how electoral management bodies can really remain independent, they can remain capable, in this new era, this new environment, I think requires us to in some ways look back and see what have electoral officials done in the past when these sorts of issues became prevalent. And so to that end, that's why we specifically wanted to invite some chief electoral officers who are now retired from those positions so that they could speak a little more freely about what their experiences were like and what kind of lessons we might be able to learn from that. So today we have two former chief electoral officers joining us here on Zoom and another one via video. So let me just introduce them first, and then I'll give them a moment to kind of share their opening thoughts. So the first is Jean-Pierre Kingsley coming from Canada. So he was the former chief electoral officer of Canada and was elected on a unanimous resolution of the House of Commons in 1990 and remained in the position for 17 years. So lots of really good experience there. There were some really important events and issues that came up during the time of his appointment, including a Bill of Rights constitutionalizing the right to vote for all Canadians and to be a candidate. Elections Canada going on to the international stage with the fall of the USSR. The Royal Commission's report in 1991 about election financing, something I know he likes to speak a bit about and hopefully will today. The advent of personal computers, and then finally a major referendum on constitutional amendments in 92. So lots of really good experiences that Jean-Pierre can share with us today. Also joining us on Zoom is Peter Wardle, the former chief executive of the Electoral Commission of the UK. He served in that role for 10 years up until 2015. Taking it from being a public sector startup organization to a respected independent part of the UK's democratic fabric. He formerly worked as a senior civil service servant and has advised independently on elections and in various parts of the world, and has been an election observer as well. So he's an advisor to the Cambridge Conference on Electoral Democracy, which is how I came in touch with him. So we're thankful for both Peter and Jean-Pierre for joining us on Zoom. You'll also see a video intervention from Lorenzo Córdova Vianello. He was the president of the National Electoral Institute for 9 years, holding a law degree from the National Autonomous University of Mexico and a doctorate in political theory from the University of Turin in Italy. So lots of experience here. And so what we'll do is I'll let each of you give about 5 minutes to respond, give your initial thoughts on the question, what makes institutions of electoral management resilient to pressures from within and without that undermine electoral integrity? So I'll be keeping time, and Jean-Pierre, perhaps you could start us off.
Well, very well. Thank you, Holly. And good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And I'll be looking forward to the question and answer session. I should like to begin by saying that when Holly listed the 5 major factors affecting Elections Canada, when I went into the position, one word came to my mind: opportunity. So many changes. This is an opportunity to really improve what it is that one is doing. But to address the issue of resiliency and integrity to begin with, I need to explain to you what Elections Canada is. That's the name of the organization. Actually, it's called the Office of the Chief Electoral Officer of Canada in the text of law. But what it is, it's effectively a one-person commission, which is independent, apolitical. All of the holders of the office have never had any political involvement, and I was the 6th. There's been 2 more since then. None have ever been involved in politics, answering directly to Parliament and effectively handling all aspects of the election. And I'll emphasize that because there's a point I want to make. We're responsible for reaching out to electors with publicity, registering electors, those that are not on the list, writing to them to tell them they're on the list, staffing and training all the electoral workers. No one comes from the bureaucracy. They're all people from outside, either retired or people seeking temporary employment. We recruit them and we train them. This is for throughout the whole country. And the other thing I wanted to say is that we also handle financial reports by political parties and candidates. And we also set the limits for how much they can spend, and we set the limits for how much money people can contribute. What is also important to understand is that it was established in 1920. So that means that it has been in existence for practically 120 years, or 100 years and 15 years, 115 years. And what that means is that the average stay, by the way, of chief electoral officers is 17 years. So that provides an insurance about the steadfastness. Moreover, you can only be removed from office if the House of Commons votes against your stay and if the Senate also votes against your stay, which effectively means you have to have done something very terrible before people will undertake that step. The other aspect that is important is that there's been no scandal. So what I'm trying to underline here is that the office has been set up in a very particular way to ensure its independence and to ensure its acceptance politically for all Canadians. And that has given it its resiliency, that and the duration of each electoral officer. And the fact that under its mandate, there is no conflict with other organizations about who's responsible for what. You know automatically if something is going wrong, it's you, the chief electoral officer, that has to solve the issue. So I hope I met the time frame, Holly, to begin the process.
Yes, no, that's perfect. Thank you so much for those opening comments. I pose the same question to you, Peter. Very different context in the UK, very different history of electoral management. So, in your experience, what would you say makes institutions of electoral management resilient to pressures that undermine electoral integrity?
Thank you, Holly. And thank you also to everybody who's taking part. I'm looking forward to it. The UK Electoral Commission is a much younger body. It started in 2000, originally really set up to oversee some newly introduced legislation on finance, money in politics, but very quickly picking up two equal responsibilities. One was around voter outreach, and the other was around ensuring consistency of electoral practice across the country. So it got to a role which is not dissimilar from a lot of other countries, but by a different route, I would say. I'm not going to talk particularly about the UK, however. What I'm going to talk about just in my initial remarks are some discussions we had in the Cambridge Conference. The Cambridge Conference, for those who haven't come across it, brings together a group of senior electoral commission leaders, usually at chairperson or chief electoral officer level, largely from across the Commonwealth, but including some other countries. And in one of our discussions around this, we came up with a rather creaky attempt to put everything into four T's, the letter T. It doesn't really work, but I'll use it because it might help people to remember. The first was tools, T for tools, and that was around making sure that the organization has a really strong capacity to do its job. That goes to resources, it goes to training, it goes to people, and it also goes to the legislation that encompasses what you do. In a lot of countries, there can be tensions between a commission group and a secretariat group, which is sometimes not helped by the establishing legislation. And one of the things we agreed that in those circumstances, it was very important to be very clear about responsibilities and accountabilities. And I guess I remember being in the Elections Canada headquarters one year and admiring the elections plan, which was on the wall of one of the conference rooms. Um, and we all, it was a good visual reminder of what we all do, which is plan backwards from election day. And I think we all said that one of the key tools is to have your election plan ready at all times, but at the same time to expect the unexpected. And I always used to say to my team, we plan for everything we can possibly expect will happen, precisely so that when something we didn't expect happens, we have some capacity to turn aside and deal with that. Our second T was themes. And that was really what are the key things that matter to the organization? Gives you a long-term direction. It gives you some sort of identity. And examples include focusing on strengthening election security, adopting technology, dealing with technological risks, promoting voter turnout, dealing with the influence of money in politics. I mean, big themes like that, which are not always entirely within the gift of the Electoral Commission, but it's important for people to know that the Electoral Commission is committed to those priorities. Our third T was tenets, by which we meant the core values by which the Commission operates. And really that went to reputation. It needs to be trusted. People need to have trust in the results that it delivers. But I think within the organization, it was very important to build a common and shared approach to what we did, because we all came from very different backgrounds, very different experiences. And we spent a lot of time as new people came into the commission, really making sure that they'd bought into the way the commission worked, the way that what the commission stood for. And we found that was important. And in the Cambridge conference, we discussed examples where that had broken down, and there'd been, clear examples of intra-commission disagreements, which really undermined things. And then our final T was the team, both the internal team, but also this is where external partnerships came in. I think when an electoral commission is under attack and needs to be resilient, it needs to be able to call on its supporters, its allies. They may be within politics, they may be within civil society, they may be international in some areas, they may be expert. And I think the role of expert partners particularly has become important with the rise of concern around digital disinformation, misinformation, etc., attack as well these days. And that takes you into some very interesting areas. For example, cooperating with a country's security agencies who may not quite approach the world from the same perspective that the Electoral Commission does. And so I think, again, a bit like with building the internal team, we couldn't underestimate the importance of putting the work in to build a shared understanding and a shared commitment to how we work together. So those were our 4 T's, which I'll leave you with.
Thank you so much, Peter. And then we also wanted to hear from Lorenzo. So Sophia is our conference assistant, is going to be showing a video that he'd prepared as way of introductions.
First
Sorry,
of all,
yeah, if you want.
I would like to thank the organizers, and in particular, Professor Holly Ann Garnett, for inviting me to participate in this seminar. I would also like to apologize to everyone, especially my fellow panelists, because an unforeseen personal commitment has prevented me from joining you in person. I would like to focus my opening remarks on the current context facing many of the world's democracies, and particularly those in Latin America, which places electoral bodies in an unprecedented situation of intense pressure and, in many cases, outright harassment by political actors and, most worryingly, by governments. In just 25 years, we have gone from celebrating democracy due to the expansion that this form of government had achieved to expressing concern about the challenges and obstacles that democracy faces today. At the beginning of the century, the concern was how to strengthen democratic achievements. Today, however, as is also the case in many regions of the world, we have seen how some countries have experienced clear authoritarian backsliding, such as in Venezuela or Nicaragua, while in others, democracies are facing a series of problems that weaken and jeopardize the viability of democracy itself. opening the door to hybrid regimes characterized by a shift toward elective autocracies. Among these problems, the following stand out. First, social discontent with democracy and its outcomes, which stems largely from the inability of democratically elected governments to resolve the major structural problems of inequality, poverty, corruption, impunity, and violence, including, in some cases, the presence of organized crime. Second, the alarming process of deinstitutionalization, or at least a severe crisis of credibility, affecting the fundamental institutions of democracy, particularly political parties and parliament. Third, the level of polarization, which is being exacerbated by the rise of attitudes of political intolerance within our societies. Fourth, the new context of post-truth, characterized by disinformation, misinformation, and malicious information. And finally, a context of attacks and harassment against the bodies responsible for controlling and overseeing the exercise of power, especially the electoral management bodies and the electoral courts. I would like to elaborate on the last point, which specifically pertains to our panel. I could begin by saying that something has changed in recent years, because the accusations and disparagement against EMBs, which unfortunately has been a common occurrence in the Latin American context, no longer comes, or at least not exclusively, from parties or candidates who have been defeated and refuse to accept adverse election results, but rather, with increasing frequency, from governments and ruling parties. Paradoxically, those who have been benefited from the existence of democratic conditions and the strong performance of electoral authorities. Those who, from positions of power, now attack and harass EMBs to undermine their independence and autonomy. Consequently, many of the attacks and disparagements that EMBs typically face are backed by the government's media, political, and even legal apparatus. This harassment occurs primarily through 5 ways. First, public disparagement coming from government circles through accusations and attacks intended to discredit these institutions in the eyes of the public. Second, threats and attacks on the reputation and personal integrity of higher electoral officials, such as personal attacks, threats of impeachment, administrative or criminal complaints, harassment of the officials or their family members, or even physically assaults. Third, budgetary strangulation to undermine the autonomy and operational capacities of electoral bodies, to the extent that, in some cases, it has rendered the EMBs unable to fulfill their legal mandate, such as installing the number of polling stations required by law. Fourth, threats of electoral reforms or changes to the law intended to increase government control or the subordination of the EMBs, to weaken their powers of arbitration, oversights, and ability to penalize violations of legal prohibitions, to erode the party system and consequently weaken electoral competition, or to undermine the democratic quality of political representation. And fifth, political takeover of constitutional oversight bodies, primarily the EMBs, through the appointment of high-ranking officials aligned with the government's interest by corrupting them, or simply by politically co-opting to bring them into line with the political agenda of the government or the ruling party. Not all of these forms of harassment occur at the same time or in every case, but there are some instances, the most troubling ones, as has happened in Mexico, where all of them are present and occur simultaneously. These are, of course, the worst-case scenarios, but unfortunately, they are becoming increasingly common. Any discussions of the resilience of electoral bodies must take into account the new adverse context in which they are having to operate and consider solutions based on it.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, Lorenzo doesn't hear me, but I'll stem my thanks later. Yeah, so thanks for sharing some of those opening high-level thoughts. I think what I wanted to do for the next half hour or so was chat through what I would see as kind of the 4 biggest issues that electoral management bodies are facing. And maybe I'm wrong, maybe there's other ones. And so that's where the chat is going to be useful. If you want to start popping questions or thoughts into the chat, we'll get to those in a second. But I thought maybe we could talk through each of these four issues, and Jean-Pierre and Peter can give us their thoughts. And I also had given them in advance to Lorenzo so he could send a video on it. So the first thing was the issue of legal framework, and I think you guys both mentioned that a little bit in your introduction, that EMBs work within the stricture of electoral codes that are set out in national law. But there's lots of variation in whether these codes encourage or inhibit EMB innovations or on-the-ground judgments. And we saw that during COVID, especially where there was this need to kind of pivot very rapidly. And so that poses opportunities and threats. On the one hand, if you have more restrictive rules-based legislation, it can prohibit experimentation, maybe with new technology, with new innovations. But on the other hand, a more principles-based legislation can leave opening for manipulation to benefit some candidates or voters over another. So the question is, from your experience, is there a sweet spot in terms of freedom to experiment and constitutional constraints? Are there dangers in too much or too little freedom in electoral codes? I'd be curious also to know what your experience was based on the electoral code that you were working with as a chief electoral officer. Do either of you want to start that conversation off? Yeah, thank you, Jean-Pierre.
Well, I was very interested in both Peter's and Lorenzo's comments, and I've attended Mexico in their elections since 1992, so I was well aware, especially during the last election. Lorenzo himself was threatened. His house was surrounded by thugs, and it's only when the president, AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, called them off. I mean, he called them off. So where were they from? This is what he means when he's saying the government is set against you. He was threatened with lawsuits that never materialized because he'd never done anything wrong. So I just thought I would emphasize that point. His experience is horrendous, effectively, and he survived it very well. Anyway, to come back to this very question about the legal framework in Canada, it's been decided right from the beginning we will have a detailed statute. We tell people how they count ballots. We tell them how they pile them. We tell them how they put them in a bag, which bag they must put them in. Everything is regulated. And what that does is that it eliminates any kind of flux about people doing things differently in one constituency as opposed to another. The strength of the federal system is that everyone is treated the same by the electoral system. Every ballot is treated the same from coast to coast to coast. And so that is why we favor the detailed law. Also, cabinet or the ministers cannot pass regulations under the statute. There are no regulations under the statute. Everything is in the statute, with two exceptions. The chief electoral officer may issue directives to handle a particular situation. I will even go so far, and just to make sure people understand how the system works here, the chief electoral officer can actually reverse a provision of the statute if the exigencies of the situation so warrant. I mean, it's not very often used, but just so people understand the authority that's given to the chief electoral officer. There is one instance where the government can intervene, and that is if the chief electoral officer recommends that an election be suspended, postponed because of an issue. There's a flood, or and people cannot go and vote. So, or it's a national emergency, or it's a provincial emergency, and the chief electoral officer will make a recommendation and the government will decide. It's very hard. And this happened once, flooding in Manitoba in 1997. And I made my recommendation and the Prime Minister said, it's not a recommendation, it's a decision. He issued that before I made the recommendation because he did not want to live with the political fallout of whatever my decision was going to be. And I decided to abide by that because we need to serve the electors and we needed to do it fast. Now, in terms of how the statute is applied, because this is what we're talking about, there is an advisory committee of political parties. And the chief electoral officer will provide information on how he intends to interpret a particular part of the statute. This is especially relevant when it comes to money in politics and a few timing issues. And so that advice is advice. The final decider or arbiter is the chief electoral officer. That's how legally it happens. Now, how do you move in a regime which is so significantly regimented? Well, one of the means whereby we were able to achieve significant results were the recommendations report that I provided to Parliament. And I'll give you examples of what we recommended. We recommended the regulation of third parties, which was unregulated before. This was a Royal Commission report. One of the factors that you mentioned initially, Holly, that dollar limits on contributions, which are now $1,700 maximum per person. The Register of Electors, a massive change in the electoral process in Canada. All of these changes occurred subsequently as a result of an initial recommendation from the Chief Electoral Officer. And the way that you do this is that you present to parliamentary committee. There's a particular parliamentary committee to whom the Chief Electoral Officer doesn't report, but effectively with whom he has discussions. And once the recommendations are in, he will be summoned to a hearing to elaborate on his recommendations. And one of the things I found was that parliamentarians are not easily equipped with understanding how to solve a problem. You cannot just go to them and say, we have a problem with third parties. They need to see a solution. And you, as the holder of the process, can make a recommendation. They will vary it, but at least they will have something to work with. So this is how effectively you can work with that type of regime. And also within an existing statute, it's incredible the flexibility that you can have. The statute says the Chief Electoral Officer shall publish reports. Well, when the web came along, I decided to put them on the web. I did not need to go to Parliament and say, I want to publish them on the web. It said publish. Publish means wherever you can publish. Before that, publish meant on paper. But we decided to do that. Online results, we moved on that front without asking anybody. We did tell Parliament that we were going to be doing it, the Parliamentary Committee. And this is how we were able to work within the system. And at the same time, because you're involving parliamentarians in the whole process, you're not, effectively making big changes. Like the register was not a final decision made by the Chief Electoral Officer. It was a legal decision made by Parliament, which is the instance which governs the statute. So my summary is that, okay, in terms of how to protect the legal framework of the statute.
And in your experience, that was effective enough that you could give the recommendations, you could have an input, but at the same time felt protected enough in your own work.
I always felt very protected because if a Parliament did not agree, then it did not agree.
Yeah.
And that was the end of it.
Yeah.
I run the system, but I do not make the laws governing the system. This is something you must understand. But at the same time, we must understand that it's feasible, it's possible to make changes within the system. And because of your position as the electoral management body, you have knowledge that you can put forward and help people make the right decisions. I cannot remember any major recommendation, except perhaps one, where the advice of the Chief Electoral Officer was not acted upon.
Okay.
And that was the detailed reporting on political parties on their expenditures. Okay, and we can elaborate on that further.
Okay.
But
yeah.
they never accepted that recommendation. All we get is a one-page report, which is incredible.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, and I see a question in the chat that we'll probably get back to later.
Okay.
About that sort of push and pull type thing. So Peter, would you feel comfortable maybe sharing a little bit about, because you are in a very different context in the UK, could you share a little bit about what your experience was like?
Yeah, sure. The interesting thing, as I mentioned before, the original concept of the UK Electoral Commission was because we needed a regulator for a new set of political finance laws. The UK was absolutely convinced that because it had been running elections for at least 170 years since the Great Reform Act of 1832, it was fine. Everything was great. No one was particularly worried about it. as far as we knew. And the politicians had all been elected through that process. They were fairly happy because they'd been elected through the process. And of course, every politician regards themselves as an expert on the election process. I once worked in our Department for Education. I find that everybody in the country basically regards themselves as an expert on school policy because they've all been to school. Politicians are slightly a smaller subset, but it's quite hard, I learned, to convince a politician that there's anything particularly wrong with the route that they took to power. But what we found when the Electoral Commission was set up, we thought, well, we can't just do political finance. Let's just have a think about what's going on in the management of elections. And we very quickly found that because we had a very devolved system, it was quite inconsistent. And in some areas, there were quite major inconsistencies. And politicians were starting to notice, because if there was a redrawing of the boundaries, or the districts, as they're called in Canada, the ridings indeed,
Yes.
the boundaries moved, and a politician would find themselves perhaps being dealt with by a new returning officer, a local returning officer. And they were doing things a little bit different. Not necessarily against the law, but their interpretation of the law was different. And when it got to some of the questions, like whether a citizen was entered on the electoral roll or not, that goes right to the heart of the democratic process. So the UK Electoral Commission very quickly decided that it had to take a strong position in terms of ensuring consistency. And so since about 4 or 5 years into the Commission's existence, the Commission has been publishing really the equivalent, I suppose, of some of the detailed instructions that Jean-Pierre talked about in the Canadian context. Not initially with the force of law, but it very quickly became the case that if a judge was considering a complaint against the work of a local returning officer, it was quite a good defense to say they'd followed the Electoral Commission's instructions. And it was a pretty bad defense to say that they'd ignored them. So we got there by a slightly circuitous route, which was to do with the history and the politics of the time. I would agree with Jean-Pierre that I think prescriptive legislation is what you have. It's great to have purposive legislation and principles based, but I think in the elections field that gets very difficult. And the example I've just given just shows you what can happen on a small scale. But if that were to go much further, it would be a really serious issue for democracy. We were able to arrest it and recalibrate it quite successfully. The problem is that if too much is set down in what we in the UK call primary legislation, so it has to be enacted by an act of Parliament, the Parliament in full flow. If you put so much detail in there and then find that it's very hard to change, so you're stuck with the legislation until Parliament, however willing it is able to find the time against all the other pressing commitments of legislation to correct a problem or an anomaly with the elections legislation. And a good example, a big example of that in the UK, I guess, was the fact our political finance legislation. It was introduced in the year 2000 after decades of arguing about this. And I'm still a bit surprised that it happened. There was a particular combination of a national mood, concern about the scandal of money in politics, a very clear mandate for the incoming government, and at a big parliamentary majority, and an individual minister, senior minister, who was prepared to push it through. And we were lucky because we got a fairly good set of basic principles in our legislation on political finance. But it was pre-digital campaigning. It was pre-crypto. All sorts of things came along later on. And trying to get the legislation to catch up with that was very difficult because we couldn't do it from the Commission. Politicians and we were very clear that there needed to be amendments and adjustments and catch up. but it was political. And instinctively, I think every politician almost unconsciously can't help making the political calculus, the electoral calculus about what the impact of making a change would be. And if there's any risk or any doubt that it might benefit their opponents more than them, then even the most high-minded politician sometimes pauses, and certainly in a party structure, that can inhibit progress. So I think it's a difficult balance. I often wished for the relationship with Parliament that Jean-Pierre had, because he was listened to and generally acted upon. In our case, we almost had to lobby like an external lobbyist. And we learned techniques. The most important thing was to be very transparent, to deal very even-handedly with all the political parties, and to work not only with the politicians in Parliament, but also the people operating the systems in the party administration, who could, in my experience, very often see the problems quicker than their political colleagues. So yeah, overall, it's got to be prescriptive. You've got to have consistency. You've got to be able to point to consistency. But it's got to be set up in such a way that immediate problems can be addressed rather than left to fester for too long.
Yeah, thank you. So for Jean-Pierre and Peter, I'm actually going to deviate from the script a little bit and go to the third issue that I wanted to talk about, because I think it dovetails really nicely with what we were just talking about. This idea of leadership, that EMBs, who is in those positions and who is in Parliament, those sorts of issues are going to affect how that relationship works. And we know that EMBs face a high level of turnover, that people can come from various government departments, from various fields and sectors. And so from your experience leading an EMB, how can the capacity of emerging EMB leaders be strengthened so that they can be engaging in these relationships with lawmakers? And how do you navigate the networks and relationships that promote or could threaten, EMB independence? And either of you have thoughts on that issue of leadership and where kind of, again, that sweet spot lies in terms of EMB leadership and developing talent and developing leadership?
Do you wish?
Oh yeah, how would you go first, Ian? Sorry, Jean-Pierre, we're going to make you go first for everything, but
Okay, I was waiting for the nod.
Oh yes, please do, please do. No, I was just waiting to see if somebody had some thoughts. So please start us off.
Because of Peter's comments, I will add something to my initial comments or my earlier comments about the changes to the statute. The Chief Electoral Officer, his report, eventually it'll be her report, receive a lot of publicity in the media. Opinion leaders, editorial writers, cartoonists have a great grand time with this, and it helps to build the public support. There's a consciousness in the Canadian public about the importance of democracy and the electoral system, which is why the electoral statute is never begging for major changes. It's been kept afloat. It's been kept with changes. I appeared before Parliamentary Committee more than anybody else in Canada, because I was forever in the wings. People were wanting to know, there's a change in this or an interpretation of that. You appear before the Parliamentary Committee. So I thought I would mention that, and I appreciate Peter mentioning that point. In terms of leadership, and I'm sure people are getting the idea here that I very much like the Canadian system. And I will tell you, if I did not like it, I would tell you. I ran hospitals in Ontario, and I decided I did not want to run hospitals in Ontario. Okay? And there's a reason for that, in which I will go elaborate. But if I'd felt that way about elections, I would tell you. But it so happens that there's so many favorable factors involved in the Canadian electoral system, at the federal level and at the provincial level, because they all emulate the federal one, that part of my presentation, or a good part of my presentation, is to elaborate on what we have, what we did. Now, in terms of leadership, when you take over an organization, okay, the first thing you want to know is, what are they doing? So you establish that, because your idea is, what is it that they're doing which they should not be doing? Is there something that is appealing? And you have to have an idea what it is that we should be doing. And so you arrive at a mission statement, so that And you'd be amazed how long those discussions are. People at various levels in the organization have a very different interpretation of what the mission, the basic mission of the organization is. So you start off by doing that so that everyone is on the game. That doesn't mean that everybody accepts 100% or agrees with you 100%, but they accept. I mean, this is why you have leadership. This is why you have a decision-making process. Now, at the federal level in Canada, at the Elections Canada is part of the public service, which means we have access to all the senior people, all the people around, the 200,000 employees. We can go and pick whomever we wish. We're also subject to the Financial Administration Act, and I'll talk about that when we talk about money, which means that we're part of the network, independent of the network, but part of it at the same time. We have the advantage of going and choosing whom we want. And as Chief Electoral Officer, what you want to do is evaluate the people that you inherited. And in most cases, everyone is acceptable. There will be one or two cases, it happens invariably, where people don't feel comfortable with you, or you may not feel comfortable with them. You choose whom you want to be your principal staff members, the 7 or 8 people who answer directly to you. You want to feel comfortable with them. You want them to feel comfortable with you. And this is how we did it. Now, I come back to the idea that because it's a one-person commission, it was easy to establish, once we established what the mission was, that this be the permanent thrust for the 17 years that I was in office. We had a clear understanding of those mission statements, by the way, the strategic plan, the plan for elections. Those require a review after every election, and a strategic plan requires a review every 5 years approximately, so that you're keeping up to date with the changes, such as, how computers are affecting the whole game. So there was never any major staffing problems. There was one particular job. There were 2 particular jobs that were difficult to staff. One of them was communications, because the network that you had in the public service are people who are used to working with a deputy minister who answers to a minister and must satisfy the minister's office on what the fundamental messages are going to be. When you're involved in elections, your main purpose in communications is to reach the elector in a way that makes him react to what is going on. When you put out an ad saying, "Are you on the list?" You got to put out an ad that really grabs them, so that what's the list? What's happening? And so that was a difficult position to staff. The other one was your director of operations, because not many, except in some parts of the public service, especially in Ottawa, you have mainly policy people. And what you need are doers. You need a thinking doer in those particular jobs, because you got to move the goalposts. You got to move. It's election time. You got to move. You can't wait until tomorrow. The law says it has to be done today. You have to do everything to make sure that that is done today. That is how leadership was exercised. And there never is any kind of contestation. You've chosen the people. They choose their people. And that's how it percolates right up to the top. So that's how I handled leadership in the organization.
Okay. Thank you. And it's interesting that you mentioned that you came from a different field and came over to elections. Was there a reason why you decided to come over to the field of elections, Jean-Pierre?
Yes. I told you that opportunity was the big word when I saw the elections framework. Okay. And in hospitals, your freedom of movement as chief executive officer is much more limited. I will tell you that. Okay. There are strengths, there are forces inside in the medical hospital network that require a lot of time and a lot of compromises. Whereby here, when you're able to move things because people have a right to vote, it's a constitutional right to vote. Mm-hmm. It made it a much more attractive field for me.
Yeah, so I'd be interested to know, Peter, the question of leadership, but then also I'd be curious to know how you got into into the job of being an electoral commissioner. But then also how you dealt with this issue of leadership, with turnover, with navigating the right sorts of networks. Yeah, I'd be curious to know your thoughts.
Sure. Um, I was a senior civil servant, as you mentioned. I'd spent my career in the civil service, and I saw an advert. I was on the train coming home from London, and I saw an advert, and I looked at it again the next day, and I thought, yeah, that looks really interesting. So it was a very um, traditional route, I suppose. Um, the first thing I did was think about the nature of the Electoral Commission. It was an independent institution, not quite unique, but very unusual in the British um, administrative setup. Um, and it was not part of the civil service. So I resigned as a civil servant in order to take the job.
Mm.
And because I thought that was a very important step to take. And when I arrived at the Electoral Commission, as you mentioned in your introduction, Holly, I mean, I described it as a public sector startup. It was very young. It was very small. Um, the guy who was running it at the time was the policy official who'd written the legislation. Um, and a bit like Jean-Pierre mentioned, there's a transition to from a conceptual to an active organization. Um, he decided that it was time for him to move on, and it was made very clear to me that that there was an expectation. This was picking up this organization and getting it going. Um, and I found that quite a lot of the staff, there weren't very many staff when I arrived, but quite a lot of them were seconded in from various bits of government. And I'd worked around government for long enough to know that some of them would have actively wanted to come and work for the Electoral Commission, and some of them might have got there by a different route. Uh, so one of the things I did, and I thought it was an important message, was to say, look, we're not going to run an independent body who has to hold the governing party to account just the same as any other political party. We're not going to run with a staff made up, who are basically going to go back into the civil service environment. So, you know, over time, over the next couple of years, we're all going to decide: do we stay with the Electoral Commission and cut our links with the civil service, or do we return to our parent government organisation? We do still have people coming across from the civil service, but actually, within a very few years, I was the exception of having a civil service background. The majority of our people had background in small p politics, charities, communication, or the sort of operational expertise that we were looking for. But interestingly, it certainly didn't stop the move across from the civil service to the Electoral Commission. And the current, my successor, but quite a few, as chief executive, used to be a diplomat. In fact, he was our ambassador, the UK's ambassador in Brazil. I knew him very well from my time when he'd been on the other side of the table working for the government, and I'd worked for the Electoral Commission. And when I heard of his appointment, I took him out for a drink, and I said to him, just out of interest, why did you take this job? And in a nutshell, he said, well, when we worked together, I looked at your role and I thought that's a really interesting and important role, which is pretty good, says something about the reputation of the organization. Let me talk about a couple of other things. I think training is very important. People are coming into an area where I used to say to people, look, you have got to be the UK's expert on this topic. People are going to look to the Electoral Commission, they're going to look to you to advise on this. So whether it was one of our lawyers, our operational experts, our political finance experts, they had to be up for the challenge of becoming expert in that field and be ready to do it in an intensely political environment where their activities and decisions were going to be commented on. They were going to be attacked, disagreed with, criticized, lampooned, all of those things. And there is a quality of resilience that not everybody felt comfortable with. So that was another thing to watch. Um, there are quite a lot of important programs across the world. I think the Bridge program has been very well known, but there are others. For example, some of the programs that the Election Commission in India runs, which are designed to strengthen fellow electoral commissions and their staff. And I think those are very important in our elections community. Top team, as Jean-Pierre said, I would totally agree with. Within a couple of years, I'd completely change all of the people who reported directly to me. Now, leadership externally, Jean-Pierre talked about this. Transparency, it's public. You don't do all of this sort of thing behind the scenes. You're going to be criticized if you do that. You have to be ready to be totally open. Your transactions, your dealings with the government, we used to publish every piece of correspondence we had. Government weren't always very happy about that, but it was important. We would send copies of what we were saying to the other political parties because it affected them as well. Jean-Pierre mentioned an advisory panel of political parties. We had something similar in the UK. It was important to try to take people with you, to try to understand, to try to make sure people understood. It was difficult because sometimes you didn't get the changes from the government that you were asking for. And one of my formative experiences within my first 12 months was appearing on the flagship morning radio program in the UK in the run up to an election, when the government had not made a change to tighten up the rules on voter registration that we'd been calling for in the interest of election security. And the interviewer, not unreasonably, said to me, "Well, why aren't you resigning if the government haven't accepted your views?" So that was it was a good early lesson on, I'd gone on there to say, get ready to vote. It's a big, exciting, event. Make sure you're on the voter register. And it turned into a, quite a personal thing about me and, why I hadn't resigned. I should say we did get that change eventually, but it was a fairly long haul. But having said that and talked about all those other interests, the fundamental watchword that we developed is what is in the interest of the voter, not the politicians, not the election administrators, not the political party, but ultimately the tie-break question for us always had to be what is going to be in the best interest, as far as we can possibly discern them, of the voter, because really there's no one else looking out for the voter. And I think that was an important part of trying to build our reputation as being on the side of voters and trying to ensure fair play in the interest of the voters having an electoral system that they would trust, that delivered results that they would trust. Lots of other stakeholders to be managed. You couldn't have done that if some of those other stakeholders were completely alienated. But it was very important for us in our decision making, particularly with difficult decisions, to try to think what is going to serve the voters' interest. I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, thank you. And you really dovetailed really nicely into the thing that I wanted to talk about next, which was opinion shifts and public opinion about electoral management. We know it's become more polarizing in recent years with problems with claims of electoral fraud without evidence, intimidation of poll workers, polarization. Even the idea that electoral management has become a polarizing issue, I think is always very strange. It's not something that people used to think that much about, but it is coming up in the national narratives in many countries. There's also this issue of violence against electoral officials, like Jean-Pierre was mentioning with Lorenzo. So how do you, when you were ahead of an EMB, how did you navigate problems with mistrust in electoral institutions, maybe the anger or threats of violence towards electoral officials, public criticism? What were your experiences dealing with that sort of environment? Was that the environment you were dealing with, or has that shifted entirely? I'd be curious to know how you've dealt with these sorts of opinion changes over time. And I know, Jean-Pierre, you were there for 17 years, right? So you probably saw those sorts of shifts happening in the time that you were at the head. Would you mind starting off this question and give us some of your thoughts on the issue?
Sure. Yeah, please. There was a bit of a shift It wasn't major, but there was a shift, and I think it's still going on. And I think it is a subset of a major political party that is principally responsible for that in Canada at this time. It would amount to maybe 20% of the electorate. And they would turn out with attacks that the decisions that were being taken were politically motivated. Well, the best way to handle that is to go out, give a press conference about the decision, and answer the questions from the journalists. And those are transported back to the people. Now, a lot of press conferences are carried live as well. I remember when we introduced the whole legislation on referendums in Canada, I was called upon to come and explain the whole process. It was fantastic because people understood this is how the process is going to run. It's different from an election, but Elections Canada knows what it's going to do. They've agreed, this is how it's going to proceed. The same thing applies to when there are criticisms that are lodged your way. And I remember one MP saying to me at a reception, he said, Jean-Pierre, no, I think he said Mr. Kingsley, but let's say Jean-Pierre. The MPs, when they ask you a question, sometimes they'd like it if you didn't respond, just let the comment stay. And I said, Mr. So-and-so, I would be happy to do that, except when the integrity of the process is the object. If there are aspersions that are going to be cast on what happens, and it puts doubt in people's minds about the process, and I'll give you an example. There was an election in Trinity Spadina that was won by 300 votes. The NDP won over the Liberals, who were the two main parties. When I went to the committee, Liberal members stood up and said, Mr. Kingsley, 10,000 people were registered on polling day. How can you say that those 300 votes made a difference? What are you going to do about this? And I said, sir, what I'm going to do is very simple. I'm going to hire the best forensic accountants in Canada, and we will trace every one of the 10,000. Everyone was astounded. We did that. It cost $500,000. I tabled the report in Parliament. And I said, this is what happened. We were able to trace them all, except a couple who had moved. And so people accepted that. But this is what I mean by defending the integrity of the process. And you do it publicly, and you face the music whenever there's a big decision, whenever there's criticism. Face the music, tell them what happened. I know that in India recently, there was an issue and the leader of the opposition criticized the commission and they did not respond with facts. They responded with a position. Well, even a Supreme Court explains its decisions. It doesn't go to a press conference to do it, but you as Chief Electoral Officer need to do that. It's a different thing. You're not interpreting a law in terms of a justice. You're applying a law that has practical repercussions for people, and therefore they have the right to know how this impacts upon them. And so this was one of the main things that we did. Media interviews. I accepted media interviews from the smallest media, the francophones in Saskatchewan. I would do radio interviews. I would accept them all. I would accept media that were considered to be a little bit too far left, a little bit too far. I don't care. Their people, whoever reads them, will know what I said. They probably will not agree because some of them are so convinced, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that the average person, the reasonable Canadian, can find where you made that decision. This is the test. But in order to reach a reasonable Canadian, you've got to go out and take the risk. And so that's what happened. And, I wanted to mention one further thing. Part of the test, because Peter alluded to this, the acceptance of results. The Canadian system is built in such a way that election night, the results come out. They're called provisional results. Everyone knows they're provisional. Everyone knows there's going to be recounting of some ballots in some places. Everyone knows that one or two ridings, or I forget the name, may flip. What are they called? I forget. what are ridings so people understand?
Electoral districts?
Circumscription or
Districts?
Constituencies in the
constituencies?
UK,
Yes,
districts in a lot of other
constituencies.
places.
Around the world, they're probably constituencies. And everyone knows this. They go to bed, they know the results is finished, the results are finished. The leaders have spoken. Leader of the party that came in last is the first to speak and say, I accept the results, the second one, and then the winner makes a fantastic speech. They all do a fantastic speech. They thank their supporters. This is part of the woven fabric, and this is what we must use, and we used it at Elections Canada to transmit to people the integrity of the process. That's how you maintain your reputation. Put it out there. And then there's recounts. Within 7 days, they can contest the results. Let them contest. And the eventual decision will be made by a regular court of law, where the judges will review the ballots that are being contested and make final decisions. All of this adds significantly to the acceptance of the credibility of the institution. And what you must do whenever there's an attack is fall back on those things, address the issue and why you addressed it the way you did.
Thank you. Peter, do you have thoughts on the public opinion shift issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's fair to say, I think it's got a lot worse since I left the Electoral Commission. Certainly in the UK, I think my successors have had a lot more to deal with in terms of direct criticism and attack than probably we did. We had quite a lot, felt like quite a lot at the time, but I think it's become much more personalized. People will trawl through social media posts and all that sort of stuff. Just the standard stuff that goes on in political campaigning throughout. We get it just as much. Let me think about a couple of things. Jean-Pierre just touched on the process for declaring results, slightly tangentially, but I mean, one interesting thing that I observed was that people are always keen to look for weaknesses in the electoral process and to try to exploit them. And that can include undermining trust by undermining confidence in the way the Electoral Commission's done its job. And I think it was a fairly common phenomenon, fairly common development across the world, that we used to have a lot of attempts to register, to play the electoral registration system. So trying to keep people off the register, trying to get on when they shouldn't be on, and so on. And in a lot of countries, that process was tightened up. And then I think we saw increasing attempts to game the system in the voting process itself. People would try to steal a valid voter registration identity and use it, or they would try to keep people away from the poll. And I always remember that, in this wonderful world of digital misinformation, I think one of the very first instances I came across, which Jean-Pierre, I'm sure, will remember, because it was one of the things he had to deal with, I believe, was one of the parties in Canada used automated telephone calls to voters to give them the useful information that there'd been a problem with their normal polling station. They should go somewhere else, which of course turned out to be the wrong place. There were attempts to disrupt the process on the day, and in response, electoral commissions tightened up processes on the day. So, for example, voter identification in the polling station, whether that's fingerprinting, biometrics, or whatever. And the attacks then continue to move. And there was quite a clear phase of people focusing on the post, the period after the count finished and before the results emerged. And I can think of one country I was observing in where there was probably about 18 hours, that period, which was not unreasonable given the size of the country, from a practitioner's perspective, not unreasonable given the size of the country, the remoteness and the technology available. However, the losing party, and they knew they'd lost. They knew perfectly well that they'd lost because they'd had their activists out in all of the polling stations reporting back. It wasn't the official party leaders, it was the sort of adherents of the party were all over the media saying, we've won a great victory, we've won a brilliant victory. And then, of course, when the chair of the Electoral Commission 18 hours later announced that the other guys had won, that was enough to make quite a lot of the citizens say, well, hang on a minute, what's going on here? I knew perfectly well, because I've been hearing it on the media for the last day and a half, that Party A won. And now the Electoral Commission says Party B has won. Perfect, because you then put the Electoral Commission on the defensive, saying, well, why have you done that? So I think, it's a good example of the sort of things that we face at every election, really. And we can all think of other examples, in a number of countries more recently where that sort of thing goes on. Threats range from the really extreme stuff. I mean, violence, actual physical attacks, death, gendered violence threats, terrible gendered abuse of election officials, to the extent that, I know election commission leaders whose families have effectively had to move out of the country during the election period because of the threats that were being made, and some very brave individuals who carried on in the face of those threats. And then another twist to that is, of course, they then have to rely on the security authorities for their own personal safety. And they'd rather not have to do that, because it makes it possible for people to say, look, they're very close to the government. So there are some real personal dilemmas that come into all of this. I think I would agree with Jean-Pierre that, in the face of all of this, you just have to keep going out there. You have to keep on going out there, giving the same consistent response and doing your best to say, look, let's get back to talking about this election. The difficult area, I think, is when you start to be asked to comment on the campaigning. And there was a point where in the UK Electoral Commission, we did start to say, look, we're the Electoral Commission, but we're not the Truth Commission. We're not going to get involved in a political debate. Party A says, vote for us and the economy will be wonderful in 5 years' time. Party B says, vote for us and vote for them and the economy will tank in 5 years' time. I mean, nobody actually can say one's right, one's the other, certainly not the Electoral Commission. And you had to go out there and remind people some basic constitutional theory that the point of an election is you put forward your arguments and the voters decide, not some independent body that says, you should trust this and not trust that. And I think wherever people have tried to get into that field, they've had their fingers burned.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things we haven't really talked a lot about, of course, is the rise of digital campaigning, and all of the problems we've got with AI, deep fakes, disinformation, misinformation, and so on. And I think the general feeling, in some places, that of course anything to do with the state, any sort of official body, gets caught up with the general attempt to say, well, you can't trust any of these guys. They're all part of the problem. Government, Electoral Commission, banks, whoever, they're all institutions that have not got your best interests at heart. And I think that means you have to redouble your efforts to protect and preserve your reputation. And to go back to something I talked about earlier, I think that's where allies come in, because quite frankly, me going on the radio or the TV or social media to say you can trust us guys, a few people might believe us. But actually, if a lot of other influencers, charities, maybe civil society groups are saying, they may not say it the way you want. I mean, some of them will say, well, they're not brilliant, but they're the best we've got. I'd settle for that. But I'd rather have a broad consensus that on the whole, the Electoral Commission's doing its best and is trying to run an election. And if they say something about the election process, you can believe them. So, if you do see something saying, for example, that your polling station has been moved, go to the Electoral Commission and ask them and get an immediate response. And I suppose once we'd learned to get out of the traditional government way of doing things, which took time, and get into instant responses instant, reliable, trusted responses. Sometimes being prepared to correct a mistake if we made a mistake, but it's more important to get out good, reliable information and to build a confidence that you can rely on what we say. That is a big part of how you deal. I mean, there are lots of other things to do with dealing with electronic interference and digital problems, which we may or may not get on to talk about. But I think focusing on the Electoral Commission being the trusted source of information about any aspect of the election process, and believing that the Electoral Commission has got your best interests at heart as a voter, is something you just have to constantly strive for.
Actually, yeah, that's one thing I saw that came up in the chat. There were two comments I think that were quite related. One of them was, in an era where there's no consensus on like 2 + 2 = 4 type thing, how can an EMB operate in that information environment? And the second one was a question about how much power over the broad electoral information environment EMB should have, because sometimes there is a bit of a question of, okay, EMBs, are you going to fix it? We have this disinformation problem. What are you going to do about it? And then what you were just mentioning, Peter, about how maybe it isn't the EMB's role to arbitrate those sorts of disputes. So maybe I'll pass this one on to Jean-Pierre. Did you have any ideas about this idea of the information environment and what the proper role of an EMB is now that the information environment has shifted towards disinformation and all of these other sorts of issues?
Well, the whole issue of disinformation is a major topic, and how to deal with it is quite major. I was not ready to deal with that today, but I will.
It's okay.
I will make a few points.
Okay, perfect.
We are dealing with a world where multi-billionaires own the media and are utilizing democracy to thwart democracy. It's the first time that billionaires do that. They usually try to influence by buying politicians to make decisions that are economically to their advantage. These people are out to change the world. So it's a very different game. And we've not laid our hands yet on how to handle all of this. In the European Union, they're trying to come out with laws that try to come to grips with this. During an election, I know that my eventual successor has introduced measures where this is flagged to the people. It's put on his site that this is the type of information that is not accurate, especially when it concerns the electoral process. Because people do try to, and I always remember seeing this as an example where in the United States, they will say Republicans vote on Monday, Democrats vote on Tuesday. And people buy into this, and it warps the whole process. And I think it has to get to the point where only the chief electoral officer can make final determinations of what the process is. And I saw erosions of this, not in this electronic age, but before then, where political parties would say, you phone us, we'll tell you where to go and vote. Well, we saw that some of them had the bad information. They were not aware of a change that had taken place. It was not ill will. But what it does is that it screws people up. Now, in terms of electronic disinformation, we're going to have to mount major efforts in our democracies. The idea that we can equate freedom of speech with anonymity of who's speaking is absolutely ludicrous. The idea that freedom of speech does not have an equal amount of responsibility is absolutely ludicrous. The fact that you can have systems of information where people go and seek and they're directed towards one piece of information based on the knowledge that that provider has about you to try to influence you to go in a particular way politically, we will have to come to grips with all these things. And we're not close to having done it yet, especially when we have in Canada, as an example, a neighbor who's going to force us or try to force us to handle our electronic communications in a particular way.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for some of those thoughts on what what you perceive especially as being some of the major challenges. I want to just noting the time. I just want to pull in another question that came up, I think twice in the chat. And so one person had asked, how do you actually deal with politicians who find it difficult to follow the electoral legal framework? Do you just simply take them to task? How do you do that? And there was also a question about, were there times where you had to push back against a government decision, or a statement regarding an issue relating to your mandate? How did you navigate it? So I was wondering, Peter, I don't know if you're willing to to start us off with that, but how do
Yeah,
you deal with that kind of having to, at some point in time, you do have to push back. And I
sure.
know that some of people who have been commenting in the chat are coming from very different contexts than the UK or Canada. We saw somebody mention that they're coming from Dominica. We have somebody coming from Botswana. We have people coming from all over the world here today. So, what are your thoughts as somebody who's both observed elections and also been in a situation of running them type thing? How do you do that pushback? How do you navigate that?
Let me start with a little story. We had some experts from one of the European institutions. I won't say which one it was, but they were very concerned about political finance, and they came to talk to us in the UK about our new set of rules. Um, and they were very expert, of course they were. Um, and they were very concerned about the fact that, we'd found that some of the parties weren't following every aspect of the new rules. And I found myself explaining to them that, particularly in the UK, we have quite a lot of quite small local parties. It's not just the major national parties. Certainly when I arrived, we had hundreds of registered parties, some of whom only ever fought very local elections, but they were registered political parties, and they had to apply, they had to follow the rules. And I did have to explain to them that the guy who ends up as treasurer of their local party, and therefore by law the individual entirely responsible for compliance with the legislation, it might be a professional accountant who spends pretty much full time in a major party and maybe has a team of people and some pretty sophisticated technology to help them. But in a small party, it may be the one who didn't turn up to the annual general meeting when they voted people into the main party positions, and found them, him or herself had become treasurer because no one else wanted to do it. People tend not to join political parties because they have a great desire to fill in forms for the Electoral Commission. They I mean, I'm still enough of an idealist to think that most people join political parties because they want to change the world for the better. And faced with some fairly tricky legislation and forms and things to fill in, that's a problem. So what do we do in the UK? We spend, and I've advised this in a lot of other countries. It's no good just saying, well, the legislation's there, and if you don't follow it, we'll prosecute you. That's no answer. You bend over backwards to explain the legislation. You say, look, we are going to hold your hand through this. We're going to make it simple. We're going to write easy read versions of the legislation. We're going to do videos. We're going to do diagrams. We're going to make design our forms in such a way that it's really hard to get it wrong as far as we can manage it. Because quite honestly, if then somebody fails to follow the rules, I'm going to have much better chance of going to a judge and saying, I want a fine, because we gave these guys every opportunity, rather than their defense being, well, how do you possibly expect me to understand all of this? It's far too complicated. So I think on the day-to-day operational level of compliance with the rules, on whether it's rules on finance or rules on nomination of candidates, running the electoral register, what parties can and cannot do in terms of communication with voters. Our approach was always to make as much effort as we could to make it clear. Frankly, I mean, obviously, the positive reason for that was because we wanted to help people to take part in the political process successfully. But I suppose the other side of the coin was, we wanted to make it very, very difficult for them to claim that they couldn't do it. So that's on the day-to-day level. The other question was about pushing back. I mean, I can think of a couple of examples. I remember we had a prime minister, one of our many prime ministers in recent years in the UK, called Theresa May, and she was the Home Secretary who introduced elections for something called a Police and Crime Commissioner. And the government took the decision that they weren't going to do anything in terms of leafleting households to tell them what these things were. And I had a rather difficult conversation on the phone with the then Home Secretary saying, nobody has a clue what these people are. You're asking them to come out and vote for an office that has not been explained to them. And there was a government website. It was to save money, basically. So the government had a website saying what they thought these people were for. But there was no real effort by the government to explain this new idea. And it was, we had to agree to disagree in the end. I made my case. I said this is a really damaging thing, and to start off a set of elections for a completely new office, it could be a real problem. When I went along to my local polling station at about 4 o'clock on the afternoon of polling day, I was the first person in the polling station, and the polls had been open since 7 a.m. that morning. So on the one hand, I was sort of vindicated, but it was very, very disappointing that we hadn't been able to do that. That was one that, I pushed back and didn't win, but I had pushed back. And actually, the next time they went round, they did it differently. I mean, certainly my experience was that some of these things didn't happen the first time, but you just kept pushing and reminding people of the problems. There's a live issue, which I think somebody's mentioned in one of the chat questions. The UK government, under the last governing party, came up with the idea of having something they called a strategy and policy statement, which was something that basically the government would draft to tell the Election Commission how to do its job. And you won't be surprised to hear that the Electoral Commission pushed back very hard on that, and was very happy to get as much support from lots of other people, whether political or civil society, as possible on that. Because it was a clear threat to the independence of the Electoral Commission. The statement is still on the statute. It does virtually nothing as far as I can see now. I mean, it's almost as if the government has not bothered to get rid of it, but at the same time has realised that they can't use it for what it was originally intended for. In other words, to control the commission. So I would say that was probably we're in the time of the World Cup. That was probably a score draw. It still needs to go. It needs to be got rid of because it's malign, and it could be very badly misused by a future government. But there's a sort of uneasy truce around it at the moment. As I said before, generally, if we had to push back, we would make it clear that we pushed back. Oh, thank you. Scott has just told me the very welcome news, which I'd missed, that the post statement is indeed about to be repealed. Good riddance, say I. The tactics, I think, is to make it very clear that you have disagreed. I mean, you shouldn't hide disagreements. If it matters to you, you put it out there. If the government or parliament isn't prepared to make the changes, then fair enough, but your position remains the same. And I can think of one big change in the UK, which was the introduction of individual voter registration with ID, that took pretty much the whole of my tenure to get accepted by the political establishment. And then one day the wind changed and we got it, so you just keep pushing, I think.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to, just in the interest of time, send over to Lorenzo, who also sent another video to share. And so Sophia, could you cue that up? So let's hear Lorenzo's thought on all of the things we've been talking about. Go for it.
The agenda for the resilience of electoral management bodies in the face of the many challenges they have is multiple and complex. But there is one aspect I consider crucial and to which I would like to dedicate this intervention. The public communication that EMBs must be able to deploy to address scenarios of disinformation and fake news, to build trust, transparency, and credibility in election results, and also to foster a foundation of consensus and public support for their actions, is essential for withstanding the attacks and harassment they are currently facing, not only from dissatisfied opposition groups, but also from within government circles. For these thoughts, I draw in particularly on the Mexican experience, where the National Electoral Institute, the INE, has faced since 2018, and particularly since 2021, constant harassment, disparagement, and discrediting from the López Obrador, the former president, administration. This has been a successful experience. In 2022 and 23, when attacks by the presidency and the ruling party resulted, first in a series of electoral reform proposals aimed at abolishing the INE and replacing it with a government-controlled body, and then, following the failure of that attempt, in efforts to weaken it, reduce its independence, and curtail its powers, which led millions of people to demonstrate publicly in squares and streets across the country against the reform initiatives and in defense of the electoral authority. I start from a premise that holds true in all cases within the current context of fake news and disinformation, which has been exacerbated by the expansion of the internet and the proliferation of social media. Today, for an EMB, technical and operational quality in organizing elections is as important as the ability to provide clear and timely information, identify and counter misinformation, and construct narratives that allow it to build trust and credibility in an extremely hostile environment. José Waldenberg, the legendary first president of Mexico's Federal Electoral Institute, the EIP in its predecessor, who administered the elections during the country's first democratic transfer of power in 2000, used to say that building trust is a slow, gradual, and complex process in which results are measured in millimeters, whereas the opposite process, that of mistrust, occurs suddenly and setbacks are measured in kilometers. With that in mind, electoral bodies must recognize that they are engaging in an ongoing process of building trust, one that should not be limited to electoral processes, but rather begins well before them. They must approach elections, which are critical moments when trust is at risk, with a reserve of trust that has been built up in advance. This implies that the institutional social communication policies of EMBs must address, at a minimum, three fundamental pillars. First, building a narrative. In an age of misinformation, EMBs must be able to craft success stories that enable them to build and cultivate public trust in their performance. Building credibility regarding the importance of their role, their technical or operational capacity, and their professionalism is essential to creating the environment of trust and public support needed to overcome the setbacks, controversies, and attacks typical of an election seasons. Today, EMBs must become storytellers, capable of connecting with broad sectors of society. Second, they must develop highly sophisticated capabilities to monitor news and information that may be malicious and could compromise their public credibility in order to build multi-channel strategies to address and counteract it in a timely manner. This is a process that takes time and cannot be improvised. And third, they must learn to navigate the new communication landscape, which includes the intensive use of social media. This involves, in addition to relying on traditional communication channels, A, translating highly complex technical and legal explanations into simple, concise messages. B, building partnerships with social media platforms administrators to fully develop communication capabilities on those platforms. And C, adopting a proactive communication strategy on these digital platforms that allows them to establish a permanent presence and thereby amplify the messages they convey. I like to say that democracy is a collective construction built from the bottom up by the citizens. In that sense, the defense of democracy and democratic institutions also requires the support of the citizenry. In the face of attacks and harassment, EMBs must be kept in mind that citizen support must be built, nurtured, and maintained in order to withstand the challenges of the present day.
Wonderful. I think that sums up a lot of what we've been talking about today really well. He wasn't even here for the talk, but he was able to sum up a lot of what we said. So in the interest of time, we're going to end it there, but please join me in thanking both Peter and Jean-Pierre for joining us here on Zoom, and Lorenzo for joining us on video.